purely from the um, supply side. So in this case, we're only really looking at Airbnb offerings, and I'll go over exactly how we did that with the data and methodology. So I'll just share my slides. Could you just let me know if you can see those? Yes? Perfect. All right. So yeah, as Yunpeng mentioned, let me just change the display settings. Yep, you can see the right screen now. Yep, great. All right.
Yes, I
So
can.
as you mentioned, I'm an associate professor in geography at the University of Queensland, and I also hold a guest appointment as a professor of geography at the University of Luxembourg. So I spend approximately 2 months a year in Luxembourg visiting colleagues in Europe. The paper is framed by a lot of controversy, and that controversy over Airbnb and short-term rentals has caused a lot of discussion in the popular media. It's caused a lot of concern amongst people in the policy and planning worlds. And of course, it's caused researchers to be very conscious of the fact that the potential exists for there to be land use conflict as well as conflict in terms of displacement and potentially even gentrification resulting from Airbnb. The way I understand it, it's considerably more acute in Europe. In Australia, we don't have large-scale protests against Airbnb. We don't have large-scale touristification. However, if you go to a city such as Venice or Florence or Barcelona or Sevilla or any number of Mediterranean or even Northern European cities like Paris, you will find considerable resistance against short-term rental platforms. The perception is that their presence is displacing locals and essentially putting money into the pockets of large global corporations. Here in Australia, there has been significant movement to not outlaw Airbnb and short-term rentals, but to at least crack down and at least regulate them in a way that puts financial penalties on owners who do decide to convert existing properties into short-term rentals. A number of different policies have been pursued. I will say that all of these policies came into effect after I wrote my paper, not because of my paper, but the paper I'm presenting today draws upon data from before the pandemic, and most of the short-term rental regulations here in Australia were implemented during the pandemic, approximately 2021, 2022. In New South Wales, which is the state that contains Sydney, there are effective bans on short-term rentals for any more than 180 days of the year. That's the state with the most strict rules. On the right, you can see that Melbourne and the state of Victoria are moving towards a tax. It's a very small tax, I think 7%. And so it has a marginal deterring effect. But I would say overwhelmingly, there's only really one state that's taken significant action against short-term rentals, and that's New South Wales. So not my state of Queensland, which is where my study is based. As you can see, this is a map I made about 7 or 8 years ago. Airbnb and short-term rentals really began as an urban phenomenon. Just like any diffusion, if you think of theories of diffusion, you might think of Airbnb as some sort of hierarchical diffusion, but also relocation diffusion. So the idea is that the original Airbnbs and platformized sharing economy rental accommodation were in San Francisco, later in places like New York and Dallas and Los Angeles, hopped across the Pacific and landed in Sydney. So Sydney became the epicenter of most short-term rentals in the early days, 2014, 2015. Airbnb quickly spread to Melbourne, Gold Coast, other parts of Australia. But you can see that even, this is, as I said, about 7 or 8 years ago, the prevalence of short-term rentals. I use short-term rentals and Airbnb interchangeably. I mean short-term rentals, but sometimes I say Airbnb because it's just easier and shorter, are really located in the center of the city. If you know anything about Sydney geography, you'll know that the most beautiful part of the city, in fact, one of the most beautiful parts of the world, I think, is the area along the harbor. So the harbor front has been, the harbor front is really attracting a lot of owners to convert their properties to short-term rentals. And then on the sort of the right-hand side, you can see Bondi Beach. I put that in big letters. Bondi Beach is a very popular international tourist destination, and you can see a large prevalence of entire homes. The farther west you go, the more private rooms you have. And oftentimes in studies, we tend to ignore private rooms simply because it's the equivalent of having a roommate or a flatmate. It's just somebody renting out an extra house, a room in their house. And in principle, planners usually have no issue with that. It's just adding additional housing supply. The issue planners have and the issue regulators have is often that the green dots, which are the entire homes, are in principle, not necessarily in practice, in principle, removing the opportunity for people to gain long-term accommodation, which isn't a problem until it is. You can see that the growth of short-term rentals in Australia was pretty much continuous until the pandemic. You can see there's a lot of seasonality to it. I'll try to use this annotation bar. So you can see that there's usually a large surge until about Christmas, which is twofold in Australia. Christmas is a big holiday, but keep in mind we're in the Southern Hemisphere, so it's also the middle of our summer. So there's usually a large summer surge followed by a dip. Sometimes there's a secondary surge around Easter, which is in April, and then there's a sort of annual cycle to it. And you can see that each summer there's a new peak. So I think at the peak of Australian short-term rentals, I think I'll show you on the next slide. Let's see if I can remove my annotations here. Hopefully I can. Hopefully they're not there to stay. No, they're there. They're there to stay. All right. How do I remove my annotations? There we go. Sorry, we stopped teaching on Zoom a while ago. So there we go. All right. So this is a graph of the number of short-term rentals, active short-term rentals. So those are short-term rentals that have been rented at least once that month. So the data set is purchased from a company called AirDNA. AirDNA sells the data on a commercial scale. And the reason we tend to use AirDNA is that they scrape off of multiple platforms. So not just Airbnb, but they also scrape off of Booking.com, Stays, VRBO, a number of other commercial providers. You can see that the number of short-term rentals in Australia really peaked just prior to the pandemic. And then it sort of shot down in two waves. So sort of wave number one was immediate when the international borders closed. And then some people held on, and then there was another downward wave when people realized that actually they were sick of doing Airbnb. And also this is when regulation came into effect. So New South Wales put their regulation into effect sort of mid-2021, and you saw a drop off of quite a few properties in New South Wales itself during that period. All right. So the research questions for this particular paper is, was there a rent gap between long-term and short-term rentals? If there's a rent gap, how does this vary over space and time? And I'll explain how we looked at that. And then do dwelling characteristics. And what do I mean by dwelling characteristics? Sometimes these are referred to as hedonic variables. But we also took into account things like geographical variables. So hedonic variables in this case would be the number of bedrooms, but you could also have hedonic variables such as the existence of a pool, the existence of a gym, a sauna, a garage. There's also operational variables. We didn't take those into account. We have in other papers. That includes things like, do they allow dogs? What time is the check-in? Are they available for one-night stays? There's a lot of variables you can throw into the mix, and we have run a regression model, which I'll present to you at the end of the presentation. And we drew upon rent gap theory. So rent gap theory is a very widely circulated theory explaining gentrification. So the idea is that it's a supply side theory, and the difference between a supply side and demand side theory is typically that the demand side theory looks at the people. So David Lay and some others who've advocated for demand-side gentrification say that cities underwent a change in their social composition somewhere around the 1970s and 80s, and they became yuppified, that increasingly professionals who worked in service industries wanted to live back in the city, and that drew investment back to the city. The supply side is the opposite, and the supply side is what we're looking at today. So we're not interested in the people, we're interested in the place, which is the building themselves. So typically, a supply side explanation has to do with the revalorization of land, uplift in the value of the land, weighed against the return on investment from a decaying property, which then in turn attracts reinvestment. And this causes gentrification. So this is from Neil Smith's classic text on gentrification. And you can see that in graph A, the actual income starts to decline over time. The reason it starts to decline is that there's some neighborhood effect. So the neighborhood falls into disarray or decay. The buildings themselves fall into disarray or decay. Keep in mind, Neil Smith was referring to New York and Edinburgh and London in the 1970s, very different than the situation today. But his idea was that these areas would attract reinvestment precisely because the rent gap between what they could be receiving and what they are receiving started to widen over time. So if there's a narrow rent gap between what you could receive and what you do receive, it's probably not worth redeveloping from the developer's perspective or the owner's perspective. However, as that rent gap widens, it is worth redeveloping. So the rationale behind our argumentation was that if there was a rent gap between the price you could get on a short-term market and the price you could get on a long-term market, if it was a narrow margin, people were likely to go with long-term market. The reason being, it's easier. Landlords can rent with certainty for 6-month contracts, 12-month contracts, even 2-year contracts. They have a steady rate of income, a steady return, only have to deal with one tenant at a time, and the fees are also considerably lower in terms of the transactional cost. However, when that gap starts to widen, landlords reconsider. And particularly, there may be some artificial widening of that gap by adding amenity. So short-term guests, for example, might want a washer and a dryer, or a dishwasher, or additional things that could make that rent gap widen, in which case they would switch from long-term to short-term. So that gap is fundamental to our argument. Another part of our argument is bid rent analysis, and this is fundamental to explaining the rent gap. So bid rent analysis is really just a series of distance decay lines. So in this case, I mean, this is based on Alonso and initially von Thunen's original observations. You have a distance decay function for each particular land use. So I'll skip to the one on the right, which is urban. So in the CBD, you've got commerce, right? So the price that commercial tenants are willing to pay is very high in the city center and relatively low. Think of a shopping mall or a retail establishment or a bank or a law firm or something like that. You then have high density residential. So this is the ground rent that apartment buildings are willing to pay, which is not quite as high as a retail tenant, but pretty much higher than a single family dwelling or a detached dwelling. And so the density gradient looks like that. It's a little bit less steep, but it's also starts a little bit lower, it ends a little bit higher. You then have low density residential and then super low density residential. So it's a series of curves, each of which sort of has a distance decay function. They're not actually linear, they're more sort of curvilinear. And then when you lay them on their side, they become concentric rings. So you've probably heard of the concentric zones model. If you extend those outward, they become zones. And effectively, that explains land use in the neoclassical city, right? It doesn't actually apply to a lot of cities around the world, particularly polycentric cities like you have in the Netherlands or Belgium. But in many cases, Australian cities are very monocentric. We have one single CBD, maybe with some exceptions in Sydney. And so the model actually works pretty well in the Australian case. I'm not the first person to have looked at the bid rent function in the context of short-term accommodation. The first person to do it was Yokeno, who looked at hotels in the tourism literature and hypothesized that hotels would locate sort of in a ring around the CBD, and that the bid rent function of hotels was higher than commerce, but lower than high-end services. Then Egan and Nield sort of extended that by looking at different typologies of hotels. And they argued that, the sort of luxury hotels, your very high-end hotels would be located near the CBD. Then you had your first type of budget hotels, were essentially downgraded versions of the luxury hotels, 2 and 3 stars as opposed to 4 and 5. Then typically you had your business hotels, which in American cities are located near the freeway or near the airport. And then on the outskirts of the city, you had budget hotels. So the argument there was that as the footprint increases, so budget hotels and business hotels often have large car parks, which occupies a lot of land. Luxury hotels often don't have car parks at all because they're in urban centers and business people and wealthy people take taxis to and from the hotel. So that was, those are the models. And then Chauvel in 2006 made a similar argument around the central tourism district, for example, in a tourist town where individual tourists would stay near the city center, perhaps even in Airbnbs, and then organized tourists would stay on the outskirts where the footprint needed to be larger. So this is our hypothesis. This is how our bid rent function looks. So on the left, you have an idealized model, and this was our hypothesis, which was that the bid rent function of short term looks like this, and the bid rent function of long term looks like this. So our hypothesis is essentially that the rent gap would be really high between short term and long term near the city center or near a particular amenity. That amenity could be a tourist attraction or a beach. It doesn't have to be a city. That rent gap would then narrow. And then at some point, there would be a crossover where the rent one could collect from long-term rents would actually exceed that of short-term rents. And you can see here, the lines are actually inverted. So they'll at some point, this might be 5 kilometers, say 5 kilometers, but it could be 10 kilometers. At some point, depending on the size of the city, the two lines will cross over. Obviously, this is oversimplified and idealized, but this is our basic hypothesis. So Neil Smith is typically the person associated with the rent gap theory. And in our case, we've looked at the difference between short-term and long-term. We're also not the first people to do this. Dave Waxsmith beat me to it. In 2017, he published a paper that's been cited, I think, over 1,000 times. So it's a really widely published paper about the potential for a rent gap to open up in New York City. So they looked at Airbnb rents as a proportion of the total rents that you can see significant change over time between, in this case, 2015 and 2017. And then they also looked at the potential for gentrification in that particular properties would be converted to short-term rentals where they were being underutilized as long-term rentals. So Waxsmith and Weisler put together sort of an index. It's actually pretty simple, neighborhood-based spatial scale, fairly simple analysis, but I think makes a really important point, which is that there is a rent gap. Interestingly, I mean, I don't know if David and co were directly involved in changing the laws, but New York City established a de facto Airbnb ban last year that has basically killed Airbnb in the city. And it may have been as a result of this research. In fact, David, when this paper came out, I remember David got in a Twitter argument with Brian Chesky, the CEO of Airbnb, about the impact of Airbnb on housing in New York. So I mean, sometimes you don't think your research matters, but in this case, it clearly did. So it's had a very significant policy impact in the US and Canada. All right, moving closer to home. So these are my 2 case study sites. I live in Brisbane. I live kind of somewhere. My university is kind of to the left of that photo, and I live kind of to the right of that photo. So yeah, we live in a reasonably large metropolitan area of about 3 million, which for those of you in China seems like a village. For those of you in Europe seems like a metropolitan area. So 3 million is large by Australian standards. It's the 3rd largest city in the country. It's a large metropolitan region that sort of includes the Sunshine Coast. So Brisbane CBD to Sunshine Coast is approximately 100 kilometers. There are people that commute every day between the two, but it's not an easy commute. So they are kind of functionally 2 separate areas. This is the state of Queensland where I live. So this is the northeastern part of Australia. Keep in mind, we're in the southern hemisphere. So this is the warmest state in the country. And within Southeast Queensland, which is the most populated part of the state, this is what we call the southeast corner. I've chosen Brisbane, which is the state capital, and the Sunshine Coast. So these maps represent real data. They are, each dot represents a different property in our short-term rental database. The light yellow is one bedrooms, and as you get darker, you get more bedrooms. So you can see, generally speaking, in Brisbane, you have smaller apartment buildings in the city center that are rented short-term, and then you have a ring of sort of reddish dots, larger homes in the suburbs, not many as a proportion. Sunshine Coast is a little different. You can see that almost all of the short-term rentals are along the coast. That's because it has a very beautiful beach and tourists go there to enjoy the beach, not much else. You can see some in what we call the hinterland. This is a relatively beautiful mountainous area that's located about 20-25 kilometers from the beach. But nonetheless, we typically see the highest cluster of properties by the beach. So in terms of our data, we drove the short-term rental data from AirDNA, which is a company located in Europe that scrapes global short-term rentals. We drew the long-term rental data from CoreLogic, which is a standard provider of long-term rental and property data in Australia. Australia has very good property data. It's to some degree mandated, but there's no secrecy rules around publishing private property transactions. And in fact, I think they have to publish the price on the buyer unless it's restricted for some reason after closing. So we have extremely good data in Australia on property, which makes these kinds of studies very easy. And we have a subscription-based model at my university to be able to use the long-term rental data. So the assumptions we made were that the holding costs per month were more expensive for a host or an owner of a short-term rental property. So a long-term rental property owner typically pays a management fee, maybe 7%. They pay taxes. Property taxes are not high in Australia. Buddy corporate, which is essentially like condominium fees, are paid in both cases. And water is statutorily mandated in the case of a long-term tenant, which is kind of weird, but it is for historical reasons. However, if you're renting a property long-term, the tenant pays the electricity, the gas, the internet, and the linens, of course, and there's no booking fee because it's done through a letting agent. In the case of short-term rentals, you have quite a few costs. So the host pays a significant property management fee, typically. They typically pay a fairly large, they do pay tax, and in fact, they pay a slightly higher council rate. It's not much, it's about 50% more, but from a relatively low base. And they pay, we made certain assumptions around how much they pay in their monthly electricity bill, gas bill, internet bill, and linen bill based on averages from published and known sources, as well as a booking fee that's taken by either Airbnb or Booking.com when you get a booking. This is what the descriptive statistics say. So just to walk you through this, in Australia, rents are enumerated in weeks like you do in the UK. In the US, they're enumerated in months. I don't know what they are in your various contexts, but so what this is saying is that the average rent for a one-bedroom apartment in Brisbane is 418 Australian dollars, which is about 250 euros. The average rent for a two-bedroom apartment in Brisbane is about $500, which is approximately 400 euros. So you can see as the properties get larger, they get more expensive. This is short-term, right? This is long-term. You can see the numbers are pretty similar in the low range, but you can see in the higher range, they're much higher. So immediately you can see that larger, more prestigious properties have a fairly significant rent gap. This is 2018, this is 2019. So you can see, for example, four-bedroom properties hypothetically would rent for $1,400 a week short-term, but only $500 a week long-term. So you'd hypothesize, looking at these numbers, that there is indeed a rent gap. On the Sunshine Coast, it's even more acute. You can see that the weekly rents for a four-bedroom house are $500, but that in theory you could get $1,400 for a four-bedroom house. Of course, the difference is that it's very seasonal, but nonetheless, a rent gap does exist. So immediately we can see the emergence of a rent gap in the data. The first thing we did to visualize this was throw it into box plots. And sorry, when I say we, I mean myself, Shenpeng Zhou, Jonathan Corcoran, and Ellen Charles Edwards, my collaborators. So we have a team of about 5 of us here at University of Queensland who work on this. Immediately, you can see the bid rent curves of both emerging. So sort of the slope of that line is the bid rent curve. You can see the blue is short term, the red is long term. So you can see they do converge at about 8 to 10 kilometers, but there is something of a rent gap sort of at the very local scale. This is the distance from the CBD in the case of Brisbane, or in the case of the Sunshine Coast, there is no CBD. It's the distance from the beach. You can also see the box plot has a very long stem, meaning there's some pretty extreme outliers. Think big 5-bedroom properties with pools and hot tubs and big terrace overlooking the ocean. That would be these properties here. So in terms of your interquartile range, you're looking at an average rental price in Brisbane of approximately $480 per week at the distance of 0 to 1 kilometers from the CBD. So you can see that there's a bid rent function on the beach, but it's much steeper. And I think the other interesting thing, you can see that they crisscross here. So very quickly, as you distance yourself from the beach, you can see that the median of short-term dips below the median of long-term, and that's sort of 5 to 8 kilometer. What this is telling us is that it's very lucrative to rent your place if it's on the beach. It's not lucrative for a short-term host to be short-term renting off the beach. They will likely convert it back to long-term. So there's some spatiality to it as well. And we looked at change over time, although I'm not sure a 2-year sample is terribly meaningful, particularly just before a global pandemic. These are simplified bid rent curves. So again, what you can see here is there is a rent gap. That rent gap is fairly significant for larger properties in particular. And you can see that the rent gap exists at almost all scales. So this is Brisbane 2018, Brisbane 2019, Sunshine Coast. Sorry, here's Sunshine Coast 2018 and Sunshine Coast 2019. So you can see that all of them have rent gaps, but some of the lines converge faster than others. So for example, what this is telling me is if a landlord were to own a 1-bedroom property, there's effectively no difference in rent between renting it long-term and short-term. In other words, they're not likely to rent studios and 1-bedroom apartments short-term because there's no inherent financial benefit to doing so. You can also see that the lines are pretty close together for 1-bedrooms, 2-bedrooms. The rent gap really widens for larger properties, and the rent gap also is much more significant on the coast, particularly at closer distances to the beach. All right, so these are actual data points. You can see there is a bit of messiness to them. The blue points are short-term, the red points are long-term. You can see, again, there's quite a few outliers. There's quite a few short-term rental places that do rent for thousands of dollars a week. But again, this is hypothetical. This is assuming you had a professional property manager running it, 52 weeks a year at maximum occupancy, which, we do have a winter. It's not a significant winter, but there is a significant drop off in tourism. It's pretty messy for the 4-bedrooms, so I don't think it's as simple as saying 4 bedrooms exhibit a rent gap at all stages, simply because there's a lot fewer data points for 4 bedrooms, and there's not a whole lot of data in the 4-bedroom category. But you can see some cases where the rents for short-term rentals exceeds the rent for long-term rentals, and other cases where you can see the lines actually crisscross here. This is the Sunshine Coast in 2019 for 1-bedroom. So if you own a 1-bedroom apartment on the Sunshine Coast, that's 5 kilometers from the beach, you're not likely to rent it long-term, and nor is there likely to be a rent gap emerging because there's a significantly robust long-term rental market and very little demand from a short-term perspective. The reason for that is simple. Oftentimes, short-term visitors fly in. Australia is not very well built for public transportation. So if you fly in, oftentimes you don't have a car. You're relying on walking. Near the beach, there's plenty of amenity. You can go to the beach. There are grocery stores. There are shops and cafes and things to do. As soon as you distance yourself from the beach, you have to have a car and some degree of local familiarity. So for tourists, it's not a very appealing option. This is the proportion of the ratio between short-term and long-term. So you can see as you get larger and as you get, as the property gets larger, there's typically more of a ratio. So you can see in the 4-bedroom category, you can earn 2.5 times as much as a host. As in the 3-bedroom category, there's, let's say, significantly more data. So for example, here, if you own a 3-bedroom property on the Sunshine Coast, if it's close to the beach, you're earning almost double on the long-term market. If it's not close to the beach, you're only earning 28% more, which means you're unlikely to convert it to short-term. You're more likely to I don't know what the magic number is, but hosts are rational actors. If they're only making an extra 10% and they have to deal with tenants and parties and disturbing their neighbors, they're probably not going to do it for more than 50% or 100%. So looking for values above 150%, you can see that typically falls in the form of large properties. And it typically falls, at least on the Sunshine Coast, it falls, in the high amenity, beachfront, beach access areas. Yeah, close to the beach and larger properties. We also ran a regression model. So the regression model seeks to explain the influence of various dependent variables on this long-term, short-term relationship. So in this case, you can see that in the long-term market, we ran them as separate models. In the long-term market, for example, you can see that an additional bedroom, so the reference group was 1 bedrooms, an additional bedroom adds $155 per week if it's a short-term rental 2-bedroom, $269 a week if it's a short-term rental 3-bedroom in Brisbane, and $800 a week if it's a short-term 4-bedroom. So you can see that the difference between those numbers is pretty large, and those are statistically significant. The other thing you can see in this graph is the bid rent function. So this is saying that for each kilometer you distance yourself from the Brisbane CBD, the rent drops by $5. So, at 20 kilometers outside the CBD, your rent will be $100 less for a similar property. And you can see that the bid rent function is pretty similar in Brisbane. The bid rent curves means they have roughly the same steepness. Sunshine Coast is different. So you can see the marginal value of each additional bedroom is roughly the same. But what you can see on the Sunshine Coast, for example, is the bid rent function is much steeper. What this is saying is for each additional kilometer from the beach, you actually lose $10 per week in potential ground rent, as opposed to $5 per week in long-term ground rent. So what this is saying is that it confirms our hypothesis, which is that the bid rent function of short-term is much steeper than the bid rent function of long-term. And it's particularly true in a Sunshine Coast, which is a very typical tourism-oriented region in Australia, as opposed to Brisbane, which is a very typical capital city region in Australia. All right, so getting to our findings. We do find that there is a rent gap between short-term and long-term rents. I think I've established that clearly at this point. It does fluctuate over time. Now, I would love to see how it's fluctuated more recently. Short-term rents do tend to exceed long-term rents in high amenity areas. So in the Brisbane city, there is significant walkability. As you distance yourself from the Brisbane city, approximately 3-4 kilometers, walkability declines rapidly. And I would predict that walkability is a big factor for short-term guests, again, who often don't have vehicles, or they're often from overseas, and people in other countries may feel afraid or intimidated or unsure about driving in Australia. So I think a lack of a car accommodates for different bid rent functions as well. In central areas, both near coastal suburbs and inner cities for larger property types. But I think the punchline, possibly the most important takeaway from our paper, is that holiday properties have a much steeper bid rent function. So if you're right in the heart of the tourism district, the potential for short-term is very high. And I think that's probably what some of the more intense battles around Airbnb are revolving around in places like Lisbon, Barcelona, Seville, Valencia, Florence, Rome, that, near the beach, near significant tourism events, there's high demand from tourists with quite a bit of money to spend. As you distance yourself from that, demand drops off considerably. And in fact, if we were to stack the sort of bid rent function of long-term, short-term, and hotels, there's probably sort of an equilibrium for all three that could be explained by the sort of concentric zone model. And I think this is an important takeaway. This is not a one-way process. So this is a two-way process. So property owners do convert their properties to short-term, but we in a separate paper, which I didn't present today, we also observed that property owners convert them back to long-term. So there's actually a significant amount of circuit switching. We see property owners wanting to maximize income. We see property owners needing to maximize income to pay increasing mortgage payments as interest rates hike up. So the period immediately after our study in 2022 was characterized by very steep hikes in mortgages. There's a particular property profile that's highly mortgaged, and some are, some aren't. But owners would need to compensate for that, and it's likely that properties switch back and forth between long-term and short-term. And eventually, I think there'll be some sort of elite equilibrium that's driven by a combination of price, building typology, geography, and regulation. I think the four of them will sort of converge to create areas that are lucrative for Airbnb and short-term rental hosts, and areas that are not. Now, one thing I wish I had the benefit of hindsight on is this is what happened to the Brisbane property market in the last, the last 15 years. So this is our study period right here. Very boring. Not a lot was going on in the property market during the study period. However, immediately after that, and immediately after the pandemic, you can see rents just shot up precipitously. And what we found, again, in another paper, not this paper, but a different one I've presented in different fora, there was a lot of shifting off the short-term market onto the long-term market. So to give you an idea, at the peak, Australia had 320 active, or 320 total, of which about 250,000 were active properties. We now have about 100,000 less properties on the short-term rental market, and maybe 30 or 40,000 less active properties. So we still haven't come back to our pre-pandemic peak of short-term rentals. And that's because the long-term rental market is extremely lucrative and hosts are rational actors. So there is significant circuit switching, whether you want to use Marx's concept of circuit switching or Neil Smith's. And I find this, before concluding, I find this very helpful. This is not my work. This is Nicole Garan. Yunpeng, are you the Wai Zhang in this? No, different Wai Zhang. Okay. Anyway, the typology here shows 5 different types of tourism. And I think the idea is that we often associate, or at least policymakers and community members often associate Airbnb and short-term rentals with invasive tourism. And I think that is the case in many places in Southern Europe, in Latin America, certainly in some of the more charming areas in Mexico or Costa Rica or Ecuador. You would have a significant amount of invasive tourism, of gringos coming in with relatively high budgets, looking to party and causing chaos. But that's the minority of global short-term rental markets. In fact, I would actually get rid of the word tourism and just put visitation, because I think if you actually look at who uses short-term rentals, increasingly as it becomes professionalized on the supply side, so you have large professional hosts who manage large numbers of properties, it also becomes professionalized on the demand side. So you have executives, families, all kinds of different users who are discovering short-term rentals as an alternative or as a supplement to hotels and long-term rentals. David Walksmith and I have chatted about this, and we think there's something we would refer to as medium-term rentals, not short-term rentals. And medium-term rentals really capture a lot of what's in the data, with people renting between 3 days and 3 weeks. It's not so much the 1 and 2 nights, it's more the 3 days, 1 week, 1 month tourism. I think that has a place in cities, potentially through platforms like Airbnb, or potentially through other mechanisms for renting them out. All right, so just some limitations. I'd really like to know how it fluctuates over time. Again, we did the study in 2018, 2019. We actually did the study in 2021, but given the pandemic, we wanted to have clean data. The data were very messy during the pandemic because the international borders were closed and there was a lot of fluctuation. So we decided to go with 2018 and 2019. In hindsight, it'd be really nice to look at how this has changed in the last 5 years. I suspect there's been movement both ways. Part of it's a result of policy, part of it's a result of economics, part of it's a result of the pandemic being over, part of it's a result of Airbnb's business model evolving over time, and other factors. What variables contribute to this rent gap? So, I mean, we've only descriptively discovered that proximity to high amenities and property size. I mean, effectively through descriptive statistics and to some degree regression. It'd be really nice to look at more detailed. So in another paper I'm working on, we kind of have found that in high amenity areas, it's typically larger properties, but in cities, it's the opposite. So we found that there's a trend towards studio apartments, and we hypothesize that they're effectively long stay hotels for workers, or international students. Australia has something like 500,000 international students, which is like 2% of our national population is international students, and it's mainly in central Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane. And so I hypothesize that these are basically being used as dormitories for adults who don't want to sign long-term leases or can't find a long-term lease for one reason or another. So it'd be really interesting to look at those variables. We also want to know how this is playing out outside of Australia. Australia is a very, I guess, lucky country in that the housing budgets of non-locals is very similar to the housing budgets of locals. So what I'm trying to say by that is that when American and German and Dutch tourists go to Greece or Egypt or Tunisia or Malta, they have a much larger housing budget than the locals do, just because the GDP per capita is much higher in Northern European countries than Southern European countries. So there's transnational gentrification going on. We don't have that in Australia because Australians' housing budgets are quite robust as it is. So it'd be really interesting to look at this in Spain or Italy or Latin America, potentially where you have a greater impact of things like digital nomads. We don't have many digital nomads in Australia. We have Australians who go to Bali to be digital nomads, but very few people come to Australia to be digital nomads. So it'd be interesting to look at that. If you'd like to cite our work, there's the link. And I think with that, I've gone about 42 minutes, and I think I'll conclude. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Finally figured out how to get my headphone work. Now, thank you very much for this very interesting talk. It's very clear, and I also found it interesting. I had quite a few questions. I think at the end somehow being answered by your update and your recent work following up from your publication with TESG. I have like two very minor questions. Then I will pass this to Ernesto. And I was wondering whether you could say a little bit more about the kind of property owners. Who are they? Are we talking about institutional property owners? Or are we talking about like the kind of ordinary citizens owning a property? And then you talk about this kind of circuit switching, you know, as if these kind of people can be very, you know, attentive to the changes of the housing market. Once they sense there's more profits can be made from switching long-term rental to short-term rental, they would do it. So just curious to hear a little more, who are the property owners that we're talking about? And secondly, is about the kind of regulation of the rental market. Are there any kind of regulations limiting this kind of circuit switching at all in Australia, like preventing this kind of circuit switching or even encouraging or whatever?
Okay, I'm just writing these down so I remember them. Okay, so the first question was about who owns. The second question was about regulating.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, so really good questions. And I mean, to be fair, I'm not sure I entirely know the answer to the first one. So I was in at the UAA conference with Agustin Cocola-Gant a few weeks ago, and he made a very good point, which is that this concept of Airbnb connecting hosts and guests is complete rubbish. There's no such thing as a host. A host was a concept derived from couch surfing, which was in the spirit of the sharing economy. When someone physically hosted you, you got to know their name, they poured you some tea when you arrived. This is not what happens. In reality, these homes are owned either by citizens or by large corporations or small corporations. Increasingly in places like Portugal, I've learned private equity companies and large institutional actors are becoming involved. That I know of, that's not the case in Australia. In part because the regulation is very murky, and I think it's probably a big risk for a big company to take in the short. I would say on the Sunshine Coast and beach areas, I would say medium-sized companies own much of the stock, not large companies, not private equity companies, maybe hundreds or thousands, but not hundreds of thousands. In cities, less so, partly because of, I mentioned body corporate, so we have this thing called strata title, and partly because of the structure of that, it's very large for a single company to buy much of a building. That said, so the ownership, I think, is relatively fragmented by global standards. The property management is increasingly corporatized and consolidated, and that's very clear in the data. We used to have, prior to the pandemic, mostly amateur hosts, and now we have effectively three types. We've got what we call full professionals who often have 5 or 10 or 20 or 40 properties under management. That they don't own them, they just manage them. I would guess that some would own them, but not many. It'd be very expensive. I mean, to give you an idea, an average property in Australia is €500,000. So you can't pick up cheap properties like you can in other countries. So you'd have to have a very large fund, and it's very risky. The second type are what we call pro-ams, so professional amateurs. These are people who maybe do it as a hobby or a second job or as a side hustle, so to speak, who run maybe 2 to 4 to 6 properties, particularly outside of major cities. And then you have full amateurs. And the full amateurs, you can see them in the data because they're a lot more seasonal. So the amateurs will list their properties when they go out of town, or they'll list an additional dwelling unit. So yeah, the answer to your question is I don't know, but my answer probably gives you some idea of it's not nearly as corporatized as Europe. From what I'm hearing from places like particularly Portugal, Spain, and Italy, it's an extremely corporate operation in Europe. In terms of regulation, no, there's no barrier at all to circuit switching whatsoever. There are some designated apartment buildings in tourist regions that cannot be rented long-term. But I would say it's maybe 15 to 20% of the Australian short-term rentals, but those have always been short-term rentals. Those have been short-term rentals even before the internet. Those are the kind of short-term rentals that are typically, the typical model is they're run by a retired couple who draws a salary, they answer the phone, they book you in, and each unit is owned by someone different. So it's a very diffused model in Australia, ownership structure compared to other countries. Yeah. I do see a question in the chat from Gedegay, so I can answer that. Can you rent the house out with refurbishment? The short answer is yes. The housing stock in Australia is very new. So particularly the Sunshine Coast has grown. I mean, I would be guessing, but I would say in the 1950s, the Sunshine Coast had 10,000 people, maybe 20,000 people, and now has 500,000. These areas have not been inhabited at a large scale for very long in modern history, I should say, contemporary history. So they're not like Europe. So Europe, or Latin America, you typically have older, charming apartment buildings with no elevator. These are, for the most part, glassy, new construction. So yes, easily. Do you need to invest in the buildings to raise the rent? No. And location means demand. Sorry. If location means different levels of demand, isn't demand. Yeah, I mean, I think it's geographic. I mean, this is a geographer speaking, but I think variation in the rent gap is geographic rather than typological. Again, Australian housing stock is usually pretty new. So an apartment's an apartment's an apartment. There's not a lot of differences in quality. I can see. Yep. So I think that covers what's been asked in the chat. Any additional
I have some
questions?
questions. I very much like your work, Thomas. This paper is excellent. I know this is one of the reference points in analysis on Airbnb and short-term rentals on land markets, I would say, and housing markets. But it's unavailable to connect with Baxmus and Weisler paper on New York in 2018 as a reference point. So my question for you, the first one is, how do you see your paper depart from Baxmus and Weisler New York? What is the added contribution that you present? I see some, but I would like to hear your reflection on that, because I have some critiques on that paper on New York.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think ours took a. I mean, I think we took a more holistic approach. I think it's been a while since I've read that paper, but my understanding is they looked at New York, a snapshot, and said, they looked at it as a linear pathway, like these places will be converted to short-term rentals if something isn't done, and we're looking at it as a more fluid relationship. So we're saying, based on geography, based on typology, based on hedonic variables, operational variables, these are the areas that are likely to have potential to be converted. And these are the areas that are not. That said, even in the local government areas with the most short-term rentals in Australia, it's only about 15% of housing stock. The Sunshine Coast is about 8% of housing stock, and Brisbane's about 2% of housing stock. So we're talking relatively low numbers. And again, you're dancing around the margins. So there's a core number of units that are likely to always be short-term rentals. There's a core number of units that are always likely to be long-term rentals. It's the margins between the two that we're saying, okay, if you look at the bid rent function, this is where the bid rent function starts to close. These are the marginal ones where, depending on the host's preferences, they may leave them as short-term rentals or they may convert them back to long-term rentals. So I think there's some marginality that's geographic, but also operational.
Yeah, but when you say geographic and locational, I think that's a contribution from your paper that one cannot see in Bashmus and Weisler 2018 paper. I think they just focus on income by the landlord, but you focus on location. You add location.
I think their paper was more of a pilot study. So I think their paper, it was the.
I know, but I think that's interesting because you and others, of course, but since you combine this bid rent function, which is basically location, you are seeing basically what is ground rent and this huge rent that landlords collect by short term or long term, or not huge, but anyway, rent. I think you can discriminate. You can see what part of this is ground rent. I think that's something that Neil Smith tried to do, and I think he didn't. He couldn't do that because he didn't have maybe the econometrics to do it. Maybe the analysis and the data wasn't available at that time, but now you are seeing that. And I think that's super interesting since you combine the bid rent and the rent gap precisely to do that. And even despite David Harvey's, when he said that we need to get rid of the font tuning, we need to make the font tuning theory untrue, I think it's just the opposite. That's Harvey's idea. It's very limiting when one has to try to make the rent gap theory progress and advance. And I think combining it with bid rent and basically with location theory, it's super important to obtain precisely what Neil Smith wanted to see, which is the ground rent component of the income that landlords collect. So that's the locational part, I think. And the other part is what you say, typological. It's either long-term or short-term without necessarily physical refurbishment. And I think that drives me, and I want to ask you whether are we seeing a different type of maybe absolute rent, given the power that some landlords have to turn their properties into short-term rental. So that's, given the same location, that gap is not locational, it's not ground rent, it's just, or it's a form of ground rent, but it's basically absolute rent, given the power that people have to turn their premises into short-term rental. So My question is whether you theorize the different types of rent that your model is presenting.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm not that deep into rent theory, but I do appreciate all your points. I mean, one point you made that's really important is that there are limits to. I think there's this assumption in the planning world that a landlord can just flick the switch and double the rent. And I think what we're showing is no, they can't. There are limits to this. There are limits based on what the property looks like and where the property is. And also there's the marginal effects as well. If everyone does it at the same time, then no one wins. So there's sort of a natural equilibrium, you know, which is determined. But I think to go back to your point, if we're seeing a different type of rent, I've been thinking about the role of planning and zoning in particular, because zoning is actually taken as a given in, I think, in land use theories these days. And there's a lot of reasons to abandon zoning. And I think the idea is that, you know, can a residential property earn more than light industrial or light commercial? I mean, the answer is yes, but they can't. You're not allowed to convert light industrial to high density residential, or you can't convert low density residential to high density residential without going through an elaborate zoning process, which in many cases is impossible. But I think as we see, I wouldn't even call it really neoliberalization. I would actually just call it liberalization of zoning around the world, which my guess is that zoning will become less prescriptive rather than more prescriptive, just because the sheer diversity of land uses. Partly because the sheer diversity of land use is broader now, and partly because toxic land uses aren't as toxic as they used to be. You know, factories don't locate in city centers anymore. So aside from NIMBYism, there's no reason not to put high density next to low density. So the point I'm making is that has a huge impact on the value of land, right? And in a perfect world, well, or an imperfect world where there's no rules at all, a complete libertarian city where you can put anything anywhere, there'll be an equilibrium. But in a city that's heavily prescribed and zoned, I think there'll be some sort of artificial pressure on these high density and medium density zones to convert to short term. So I think in a way, zoning is actually causing more harm than good.
Yeah, and also zoning is related to location. So probably more central areas, zoning will be more free and
But
less
it's recursive,
restricted.
right? Planners assume central locations should be more dense, and therefore they are more dense. And then they're zoned
So
more
they are zoned.
dense.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. But the other
So
thing is yeah, go ahead.
in those central zones that you are seeing where the gap between long-term and short-term rentals are more evident, maybe trying to bring the rent gap theory again to try to interpret your results. Maybe are we seeing capitalized ground rent in the long term and potential ground rent are the short terms? Do you say that in your paper or not? I'm not sure, but I think maybe that could be a sort of theorization from your data. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be happy to explore that with you for sure. I mean, one thing I can say is that in terms of zoning, where hotels can locate is very prescribed, right? Hotels can only be usually in the downtown or out by the freeway, and nothing in the middle. But there's a lot of demand everywhere throughout the city. So if you think of it as a statistical surface, you know, demand sort of exerts pressure at certain places, and in certain places it bends, and in certain places it can't bend. So yeah, I haven't thought of it insofar as the sort of absolute ground rent you've described, but it's a good idea.
Oh, last question, short one. Sorry, Yunpeng, I don't want to monopolize, but are you planning to see previous periods before the Airbnb was applied in Australia? Because maybe an event study from the moment that Airbnb was started to be applied, maybe change the long-term curve.
Yeah.
There should be
Look,
an interaction, maybe. I mean, the long-term trend of the long-term rentals, maybe they were transformed because you have another competitor in the market.
Yeah, and that's sort of, I mean, it's a pretty simple theorization, but just adding that additional bid rent curve to the concentric zone model means that we think there's local maxima and local minima for short term, which is a completely new, not completely, but somewhat new yet land use. And I suspect what'll happen is that policy and regulation will catch up in about 10 years, and eventually there'll be zones for long term and short term.
That's amazing. Amazing work, Thomas.
Oh, thank
Thank you very much. I mean, I really admire your work. Thank you. I think we cannot hear you, Yongpeng. No.
Sorry, I can't hear you. You can type your question.
No, I don't have a question. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Ah, okay. I was just saying we still have a few minutes for Q&A. Maybe there are some more questions from the audience. No. No, I don't see anyone raising hands or in the Q&A box. No, I don't see any more questions. Maybe we should call it a day. I know it's probably already quite late in Australia. It's past 10, right?
It is, yeah. I'm happy to take any more questions. The other thing I would mention is that David Waxsmith and I, the author of the other paper, are doing a special issue. We're pitching a special issue on short-term rentals to regional studies. It's still in the development phase, so we need to provide the regional studies editorial team with a list of potential authors. So if you would like to contribute, there's no guarantee that your paper will be accepted, but if you'd like to contribute and submit a paper, please send me the title and potentially an abstract, and I can include it in the proposal.
Sure.
That's great.
Excellent.
Great invitation. I will spread the voice.
Yeah, that would be great, Ernesto. That would be really helpful because we're looking
amazing.
for more quality submissions for the proposal.
Fantastic.
Yeah, we do have 2 contributors to this special issue work on short-term rentals. I think we can probably also inform them about this opportunity as well.
Great.
Yeah, thank you very much, Thomas. It was such a very informative, clear, and interesting talk. And I would like to read more about your follow-up studies on the short-term rental, especially the one talking about the whole circuit switching, which is very interesting to know. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks to all the audience who joined today's lecture. We hope to see you again.
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks so much for putting the special issue together and for hosting me tonight or today.
My pleasure. Bye-bye.
All right.
Thank you.
Adios.
Bye.